The Defense Department asked us to look at how can we impose costs in Russia. Specifically, what can we do to force Russia to invest more in different areas than it would cost the United States? On the geopolitical front, I think the area that we found that would be most fruitful would be a topic that's very much on the news for today, lethal aid to Ukraine. The Russians care a whole lot more about Ukraine than, in the grand scheme of things, the United States does. They were willing to spend a lot of resources there.
We looked at Russia's vulnerabilities and anxieties. Anxieties, the regime is concerned about its own stability, survivability. This may be an exaggerated concern, but it's definitely a concern. They remember the collapse of the Soviet Union. They remember the color revolutions in Ukraine and Serbia and Georgia, and they fear that the same might occur in Russia. Vulnerabilities principle is its heavy dependence on oil and gas exports.
We could broaden the sectors that are covered by sanctions. The other area is deepening them. For example, in energy, they mostly apply to deep water, to shale and to Arctic, but we can extend those further throughout the Russian energy industry. So there are things we can do. These will have costs as well on U.S. companies and European companies if we do them.
Moreover, any sort of cost imposition strategy, the frontline states are not going to be the United States, it's going to be Europe. So it's key to sort of make sure that we are arm in arm with our NATO allies and other partners in the region going forward, because that's the only way this is actually going to work and be successful.
Chapter 4. Geopolitical Measures. Perhaps the most literal way to extend Russia would be to increase the costs of its foreign commitments. As early as the 1940s, George Kennan, the father of containment, suggested that the Soviet Union was already overextended and that the military, economic, and political costs of sustaining its empire would ultimately be one of the factors leading to the reform or collapse of the communist system. Russia today is far less extended than the old Soviet Union. Its domestic population is much more homogeneous, with ethnic Russians composing more than 77% of its population. Its external commitments are far more limited, comprising only small bits of Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, and a larger portion of Syria. It does face active opposition, however, in both eastern Ukraine and Syria. The United States has provided limited support to Russia's opponents in both countries and might do more, thereby driving up Russian costs. Proxy competition of this sort is not new. Indeed, the Great Game characterized interstate relations for several centuries as aspirant global powers clashed over conflicting spheres of influence. The renewal of such maneuvering marks a return to a form of geopolitical competition that some analysts argue took a brief hiatus after the end of the Cold War, when the United States was left as the lone superpower and the ideology of liberal democracy seemed to reign supreme. This chapter describes 6 possible U.S. moves in the current geopolitical competition: providing lethal arms to Ukraine, resuming support to the Syrian rebels, promoting regime change in Belarus, exploiting Armenian and Azeri tensions, intensifying attention to Central Asia, and isolating Transnistria, a Russian-occupied enclave within Moldova. There are several other possible geopolitical moves discussed in other RAND research, but not directly evaluated here, including intensifying NATO's relationship with Sweden and Finland, pressuring Russia's claims in the Arctic, and checking Russia's attempts to expand its influence in Asia. Intensifying the challenge to Russian military presence and operations abroad could have several consequences. It might cause Russia to withdraw from some of these commitments, which could be an important win for the United States, but would do the opposite of extending Russia, causing it, rather, to contract, perhaps to a more defensible perimeter. Crimea, eastern Ukraine, and Syria are drains on the Russian treasury and defense budget. Alternatively, and more likely, Russia might escalate, possibly seizing more of Ukraine, supporting further advances of the Damascus regime, or actually occupying a wavering Belarus. Such moves would likely impose serious additional strains on Russian defense and economic capacity, but would also represent a serious setback for U.S. policy. Given this range of possible responses, any U.S. moves of the sort described in this chapter would need to be carefully calibrated and pursued within some larger policy framework. Measure 1. Provide lethal aid to Ukraine. On November 21, 2013, protests in Maidan Square broke out after President Yanukovych, under pressure from Moscow, rejected an association agreement with the EU. More than 100 protesters were killed over the next several months, and the Yanukovych regime collapsed in February 2014. Within days, Russian troops seized Crimea's airport and other strategic locations in a largely bloodless invasion, and 96% of Crimean voters, many of whom are ethnic Russian, voted in a referendum marred by accusations of fraud to secede from Ukraine and join Russia on March 16, 2014. In the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine, a Russian-inspired intervention started similarly, but did not go as smoothly. Armed separatists seized key buildings in the region in April 2014 and later held referendums, where the populations of Donetsk and Luhansk voted overwhelmingly, 89% and 96% of those voting, respectively, for independence. This time, however, Ukraine fought back. Newly elected Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko ordered an anti-terrorist operation targeting the separatists that summer. By early 2017, some 60,000 Ukrainian soldiers were facing off against some 40,000 Russian-backed separatist forces, including an estimated 5,000 Russian soldiers, in a conflict that has so far cost some 10,000 people their lives. The United States and its European allies imposed economic sanctions on Russia and provided Ukraine with economic and non-lethal military assistance. In 2014, Congress authorized military and economic assistance under the Ukraine Freedom Support Act. From then through fiscal year FY 2016, the United States provided $600 million in security assistance. These funds have been used to train Ukrainian military forces and provided non-lethal military equipment, including counter-artillery and counter-mortar radars, secure communications, logistics systems, tactical unmanned reconnaissance aircraft, and medical equipment. During the 2014 Wales Summit, NATO also agreed to aid Ukraine with command, control, communications and computers, logistics, cyber defense, military personnel, and medical support issues. The United States could increase its military assistance to Ukraine in terms of both the quantity and quality of weapons. In a February 2, 2017, open letter to President Trump, Senator John McCain urged him to provide defensive lethal assistance to Ukraine to defend its territory against further violations by Russia and its separatist proxies in response to the uptick in violence in eastern Ukraine. McCain's statement echoed a February 2015 letter from Democratic Assistant Minority Leader Senator Dick Durbin and Ohio Republican Senator Rob Portman, also calling for the United States to provide anti-tank missiles to Ukraine. In December 2017, the United States approved the sale of defensive lethal weapons to Ukraine, although it did not specify what weapons fell into the category. The United States could also become more vocal in its support for NATO membership for Ukraine. Some U.S. policymakers, including Republican Senator and 2016 presidential candidate Marco Rubio, backed this approach in the past, and Ukrainian President Poroshenko recently promised to hold a referendum on the issue in the near future. While NATO's requirement for unanimity makes it unlikely that Ukraine could gain membership in the foreseeable future, Washington's pushing this possibility could boost Ukrainian resolve, while leading Russia to redouble its efforts to forestall such a development. Benefits: expanding U.S. assistance to Ukraine, including lethal military assistance, would likely increase the costs to Russia, in both blood and treasure, of holding the Donbas region. More Russian aid to the separatists and an additional Russian troop presence would likely be required, leading to larger expenditures, equipment losses, and Russian casualties. The latter could become quite controversial at home, as it did when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. Two other somewhat more speculative benefits might flow from such an expanded U.S. commitment. Countries elsewhere that look to the United States for their security might be heartened. Some of those states might find new reasons to avoid developing their own nuclear weapons. In the December 1994 Budapest Memorandum, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia provided the newly sovereign Ukraine with security assurances in exchange for Ukraine giving up its 4,000 warhead nuclear arsenal. Action by the United States to make good on these assurances could enhance the credibility of formal and informal security guarantees that the United States has provided other partners around the world, and could reduce their perceived need for their own nuclear deterrence. These benefits, however, would only accrue if the additional U.S. assistance actually allowed Ukraine to prevail in its conflict with Russia. Moreover, some scholars doubt whether doubling down on support for Ukraine would matter much regarding global nuclear non-proliferation, based on the argument that countries' decisions to develop nuclear weapons often are very localized and context-specific. Risks. An increase in U.S. security assistance to Ukraine would likely lead to a commensurate increase in both Russian aid to the separatists and Russian military forces in Ukraine, thus sustaining the conflict at a somewhat higher level of intensity. Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, the former commanding general of U.S. Army Europe, argued against giving Javelin anti-tank missiles to Ukraine for precisely this reason. Alternatively, Russia might counter-escalate, committing more troops and pushing them deeper into Ukraine. Russia might even preempt U.S. action, escalating before any additional U.S. aid arrives. Such escalation might extend Russia. Eastern Ukraine is already a drain. Taking more of Ukraine might only increase the burden, albeit at the expense of the Ukrainian people. However, such a move might also come at a significant cost to Ukraine and to U.S. prestige and credibility. This could produce disproportionately large Ukrainian casualties, territorial losses, and refugee flows. It might even lead Ukraine into a disadvantageous peace. Some analysts maintain that Russia lacks the resources to escalate the conflict. Ivan Medinsky of the Kiev-based Institute for World Policy argued, war is expensive. Falling oil prices, economic decline, sanctions, and a campaign in Syria, all of which are likely to continue in 2016, leave little room for another large-scale military maneuver by Russia. According to this view, Russia simply cannot afford to maintain a proxy war in Ukraine, although, given Russia's size and the importance it places on Ukraine, this might be an overly optimistic assumption. There is also some risk of weapons supplied to the Ukrainians winding up in the wrong hands. A RAM study conducted for the president of Ukraine found reasons for concern about the potential misuse of Western military aid. While Ukraine has been tarred by Russian propaganda claims that it mishandled Western military aid, the RAND team also found that Ukraine's paper systems for tracking equipment are outdated and vulnerable to corruption. Moreover, the RAND team also expressed concern that, absent reforms to Ukraine's defense industry, Western military equipment might be reverse-engineered and enter the international market in competition with U.S. suppliers. Ultimately, the team concluded, the perception of misuse or corruption, whatever the reality, is sufficient to deter donors that might otherwise provide free equipment or supplies, and to make U.S. or other officials concerned that Ukraine cannot be trusted with high-tech systems. The RAND team also concluded, however, that these problems are fixable and offered recommendations to Ukraine on how to overcome them. On the other hand, Ukraine is certainly a more capable and reliable partner than others to whom the United States has provided lethal equipment, for instance, the anti-Russian Afghan Mujahideen in the 1980s. One might imagine an unacknowledged U.S. effort to provide Ukraine with weapons of non-U.S. origin, but such efforts likely would not remain secret for long. Furthermore, Ukraine can probably procure such weapons itself on the open market. Finally, if the United States were to boost aid to Ukraine against the advice of its principal European allies, it could endanger European support for the Russia sanctions regime, which relies more heavily on European adherence than on U.S. adherence. While NATO members located close to Russia, such as Poland, generally take a more hawkish approach to Ukraine, most Western European governments remain cautious. According to a 2015 Pew survey, 59% of Frenchmen, 65% of Italians, 66% of Spaniards, and 77% of Germans opposed NATO sending arms to Ukraine. Indeed, according to reporting by the German newspaper Der Spiegel, former NATO Supreme Allied Commander General Philipp Breedlove viewed the German government as one of the major obstacles to boosting aid to Ukraine. Oddly enough, the same 2015 survey showed somewhat higher levels of European support for Ukraine joining NATO. That suggestion had majority support in the United Kingdom, Europe, Poland, France, and Spain. However, 57% of Germans opposed this. measure, and NATO operates by consensus, which means that any proposal to admit Ukraine into the alliance would need to garner unanimous support. More vocal US advocacy of NATO membership for Ukraine would likely strengthen both Ukrainian morale and Russian determination to prevent such a development, thereby perhaps further extending Russia's commitment and costs. Such a move would also engender opposition within NATO, detracting from what has otherwise been a rather united front in opposition to Russian aggression. Likelihood of success. Eastern Ukraine is already a significant drain on Russian resources, exacerbated by the accompanying Western sanctions. Increasing US military aid would certainly drive up the Russian costs, but doing so could also increase the loss of Ukrainian lives and territory, or result in a disadvantageous peace settlement. This would generally be seen as a serious setback for US policy. Conclusion. The option of expanding US military aid to Ukraine has to be evaluated principally on whether doing so could help end the conflict in the Donbass on acceptable terms rather than simply on costs it imposes on Moscow. Boosting US aid as part of a broader diplomatic strategy to advance a settlement might well make sense, but calibrating the level of assistance to produce the desired effect while avoiding a damaging counter-escalation would be challenging. Measure 2. Increase support to the Syrian rebels. Syria is another battlefield where Russian costs might be driven up by expanded US support to local, in this case, anti-regime forces. The Syrian civil war began in March 2011 as an outgrowth of the Arab Spring. It pitted primarily Sunni rebels backed by the United States and the Gulf states against the Iranian and Russian-backed Alawite government of al-Assad, whose family has ruled Syria since 1970. Russia has provided the Assad regime with economic and military support over the years and stepped up its support after civil war broke out in 2011. In September 2015, Russia began direct military action in Syria targeting rebel groups, some backed by the United States, with airstrikes under the guise of fighting terrorism. During 2016, Russia deployed more military assets to the region, including advanced air defense systems. By the end of 2017, Russia announced that it planned to maintain a permanent presence in the country, including a more robust presence at its long-standing Tartus naval base and the inland air base of Khmeimim. Russia's intervention allowed the Syrian government to retake Aleppo and advance on several other fronts under both Presidents Obama and Trump. The United States has concentrated its military efforts on supporting local Kurdish-dominated forces in the east of the country in offensives against the Islamic State. Exceptions have been two limited airstrikes, one against a regime airfield in retaliation for the Syrian government's use of chemical weapons, and the other against a pro-regime Iranian-backed militia column approaching too closely to a U.S.-occupied airfield. U.S.-backed Arab opponents of the regime in the west of the country have lost ground both to the regime and to more extremist al-Qaeda-affiliated elements. In 2015, Russia's intervention in Syria cost an estimated $2.4 million to $4 million a day, according to the Moscow Times and IHS Yane's estimates. Given the size of Russia's defense budget, $50 billion that year, the sum might not be significant in and of itself. These costs might be increased if the United States increases its backing for anti-regime fighters. There are at least two possible ways for the United States to aid the rebels. First, the United States could supply anti-Assad rebels with military aid. Russia already indicated that it views US aid to the Syrian rebels as a threat. When the United States passed a law easing the weapons restrictions for the rebels in December 2016, Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova responded angrily. Washington has placed its bets on supplying military aid to anti-government forces who don't differ that much from bloodthirsty head choppers. We therefore view the step as a hostile act. Zakharova argued that this move directly threatened Russian troops in Syria. Given these sentiments, if the United States were to pursue this policy in the future, it likely would provoke a Russian response. The United States might provide the rebels with air support, or at least deny the Syrian government the use of air power through a no-fly zone. Several high-profile actors from former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton to Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan advocated no-fly zones. This might be conducted in conjunction with creating safe zones or areas that would protect the civilian population from ground attack as well through either the threat of or the explicit use of force against Syrian government and presumably also Islamic extremist forces. For his part, President Trump expressed some openness to both ideas. On January 27, 2017, Trump said he will absolutely do safe zones in Syria, although he did not specify how he would execute these strategies. More recently, the Trump administration seems to have been moving in the opposite direction, reportedly ending a CIA program to arm untrained anti-regime elements. The United States is continuing to arm, train, and provide air support to Kurdish and Arab opponents of the Islamic State, some of whom might ultimately wish for help in defending against the Damascus regime as well. Benefits: increased U.S. support to the moderate Syrian opposition could perpetuate and intensify a civil war that had begun to wind down, thereby imposing attritional costs on both Russia and Iran. Iran already spent significant resources to prop up Assad between $6 billion and $35 billion annually, according to some estimates, and the United States could help to drive the price tag up further. Such support could also reduce the moderate opposition's reliance on the better armed, more extremist groups, and ultimately might improve the willingness and ability of moderate opposition forces to combat the more extremist elements. Risks: unlike Ukraine, the United States does not have a single actor to aid in the fight in Syria, but rather faces a plethora of groups, often with murky affiliations, increasing the chances of weapons falling into the wrong hands. The New York Times reported in 2016 that weapons intended for Syrian rebels and shipped into Jordan and Saudi Arabia by the CIA had been systematically stolen, and that, as a result, the Middle East black market for arms is now awash in assault rifles, mortars, and rocket-propelled grenades. Second, arming the rebels would fuel greater turmoil in Syria. For better or worse, the Syrian government has made significant gains in such places as Aleppo with Russian help. Aiding the rebels could prolong the conflict, but barring direct U.S. military intervention against the Damascus regime probably would not change the ultimate outcome. Additional refugee flows might put further pressure on Syria's immediate neighbors, several of whom, Jordan, Turkey, and Israel, are U.S. allies. Finally, supporting the rebels could run counter to the most prominent objective of the Trump administration's Middle East foreign policy: fighting radical Islamist terrorism. As Trump argued, by defeating the Syrian government, the United States would also destroy an enemy of the radical Sunni Islamic terrorist groups. Indeed, as the United States saw in Iraq and later in Libya, terrorist groups often can thrive in the political vacuums left by the downfall of strongman governments. As noted, it is unlikely that any level of U.S. arms and training could shift the balance of forces in the Syrian opposition's favor. Only the direct application of U.S. air power, advisors, and other enabling capabilities could have such an effect. This would bring U.S. forces into direct contact with Russian forces in the air and Iranian ones on the ground. The United States and Russia might try to avoid direct combat, but the risk of escalation would be high. Iran might respond by employing local proxies in Iraq and Afghanistan to attack U.S. forces there. U.S. officials have occasionally considered the establishment of safe zones in Syria. Russia, Turkey, and Iran have recently agreed to establish deconfliction zones that could serve much the same purpose. To the extent that such arrangements take hold, they could reduce the violence and promote some interim peace within a still badly divided Syria. This would reduce the burden imposed by the conflict on Russia and Iran, to be replaced perhaps by the costs of policing these ceasefire lines and beginning reconstruction in the regime-held areas, which are unlikely to receive much Western assistance. Likelihood of success: apart from the risks outlined above, any policy to boost support to the Syrian rebels would likely need to overcome multiple hurdles, starting with a political obstacle. Aiding the Syrian rebels has never been popular. Back in 2013, Gallup found that only 37% of Americans approved of Obama administration plans to arm the rebels, 54% disapproved. Since then, the numbers declined further as the Obama administration's attempts to stand up a moderate opposition faltered. Polling from August 2016 showed that a mere 26% of Americans supported such a move. Reverting back to such a policy, consequently, would require a significant effort to sell it to the American public. The United States would also face an international political hurdle. Boosting support to anti-regime elements would likely require Turkish cooperation, because Turkey is not only geographically adjacent to Syria, but also one of the most powerful actors backing the opposition. Turkey, however, might back the initiative only if the United States were to cease its support for the Kurdish rebels that Turkey views as a threat. The Kurds, however, are staunch US allies in Syria and Iraq, and one of most militarily competent secular rebel groups remaining. Finding other rebel groups without ties to Islamic extremist organizations would also be difficult. Much of the moderate opposition has already been eliminated, and US attempts to build its own Syrian opposition failed. For example, according to media accounts, the US Department of Defense clashed with the CIA over whether the Aleppo rebels were affiliated with al-Qaeda in Syria or with Jabhat al-Nusra, and whether they deserved US military aid. Finally, in the highly unlikely event of total success if Russia were to abandon the Assad regime and the opposition were to seize Damascus, the result would be a major geopolitical setback for Moscow, but also a major contraction in its foreign commitments and associated expenditures, not to mention a huge responsibility for the United States and its allies to assume. Conclusion. This course of action might have been viable a few years ago, when the armed opposition was stronger and less radicalized. Under current circumstances, the most that expanded US aid could likely do would be to perpetuate a conflict that has already destabilized an entire region. Russia might be forced to pay a bit more for its Syrian commitment, but only at the cost of continued regional turbulence, societal radicalization, and increased civilian casualties and displaced personnel. Measure 3. Promote regime change in Belarus. Belarus is Russia's most important ally. It provides a buffer between Russia and major NATO countries and is the initial link in Russia's ground lines of communication between the mainland and Kaliningrad, the Russian enclave entirely encircled by Lithuania and Poland. Already host to Russian forces, Belarus features prominently in many notional conflicts among the United States, NATO, and Russia. Russia has had a reliable friend at the helm of Belarus, President Alexander Lukashenko. For the past several decades, Lukashenko stayed in power by exploiting Belarus' position as a key transit point for Russian oil and natural gas, while centralizing his political power and marginalizing his political opponents. As Belarusian political analyst Sci-Fi Bodon writes, the political opposition is suffering from years of exclusion from public sphere. They have not held a seat in parliament since 1996. They are virtually ignored by state-affiliated media, and the government have restricted their right to protest. In October 2015, Lukashenko won re-election with 83.5% of the vote in an election fraught with problems. And yet, Lukashenko's grip on Belarus might be loosening. Beginning in 2015, oil prices and foreign support dipped and Belarus faced a worsening recession. Political scientists Charles Crabtree, Christopher J. Faris, and Paul Studer argue that this challenged Lukashenko's unspoken political compact with Belarusians that involves him providing large social welfare programs in exchange for political acquiescence. Lukashenko responded by blaming the unemployed and the underemployed for not trying to find work. He introduced a law against social parasites, targeting people who work fewer than 183 days a year, with an annual tax of $250, a sizable fine considering that most Belarusians made an average of $380 a month at the start of 2017. The tax affected some 470,000 people, according to the Belarusian tax ministry, and failing to pay it could be punished with up to 15 days in jail. The 2016 social parasite tax deadline came on February 20, 2017. Some 54,000 individuals paid the tax, many more did not. Beginning on February 17, thousands of Belarusians took to the streets to protest the tax. The government initially allowed the protest and even waived the collection of the tax, but the protests continued and eventually the government cracked down. By March 27, 2017, according to human rights groups, at least 1,000 people were arrested and 150 were sentenced to up to 25 days in jail. From the opposition standpoint, the protests presented an opportunity to build on the outrage to create a more sustained, far-reaching movement. As Anatol Lyabedska, leader of the opposition United Civic Party, stated, "It will never do to be satisfied with a scrap thrown by the authorities. We have to continue demanding a completely different situation. It is necessary to change a large number of laws, to create different opportunities for the people, to give them a right to choose." From a US policy standpoint, Belarus unrest might present an opportunity to extend Russia by aiding the opposition, removing a long-standing Russian ally dictator, and supporting liberalization. This aid to Lukashenko's opposition could come in a variety of forms, ranging from public declarations of support by US leaders to more direct financial and organizational assistance helping the opposition parties reach the end state of being a free and democratic Belarus. Alternatively, the United States could adopt precisely the opposite approach and try to leverage the recent unrest to build a closer relationship with Lukashenko's regime through the offers of economic aid. Benefits. In a zero-sum world, denying Russia its one and only true ally would be a clear geopolitical and ideological gain for the West. It would bring an end to Europe's last dictatorship, a long-standing US policy goal. Moreover, it would undermine Russia's attempt to create an EU in competition with the EU, complicate any Russian attempt to employ military force against the Baltic states, and further isolate Kaliningrad. Even if US efforts to boost local opposition to the existing regime in Minsk fail to bring about democratic change, the existence of such a campaign would create apprehensions among Russian leaders who have tended to exaggerate the Western role on other color revolutions and even worry about the prospect of such a movement in their own country. The possible utility of stepping up the ideological and informational competition with Russia inside and outside that country is explored in Chapter 5. One possible Russian reaction might be to reinforce its military presence and political influence within Belarus. This would further burden Russia with a weak, corrupt dependency and might even generate some degree of local resistance. On the other hand, it would also increase the military threat to the Baltic states, Poland, and Ukraine by sheer proximity. Risks. Russia likely regards a friendly Belarus as even more important to its security than Ukraine. Any effort to alter the character or geopolitical orientation of the government in Minsk would likely encounter a strong and, if necessary, violent Russian reaction. At the very least, Russia would likely employ political and economic pressure to keep the regime in place. The most likely domestic response in Belarus to such a campaign would be greater local repression and efforts to brand any domestic opposition in Belarus as agents of the West. In the less likely event that the opposition would be able to mount a serious challenge to the existing regime, some more substantial form of Russian intervention would seem likely. Russia already runs regular military exercises in the country. It might also respond by stepping up its own efforts to destabilize third-country regimes in the West or elsewhere in the former Soviet space. Likelihood of success. Starting revolutions is not easy, and the United States lending public support to opposition movements does not guarantee that they will be successful. In 2007, Gallup found that 60% of Belarusian respondents believed democracy was important and 47% believed it was somewhat very important for Belarus to have an active opposition party. A 2013 poll similarly found that 55% of Belarusian respondents had a positive image of the EU, up 15% from 5 years earlier. That said, more recent polling found that Belarusians were not clamoring for revolution. An independent Institute for Socio-Economic and Political Research survey in 2015 found that 78% of Belarusians believed a better future was not worth people's blood, and 70% did not want a Ukrainian-style revolution. As Belarusian expert Borys Jarabik summed up, people don't want more freedom. They want more government. They want the better life they used to have. Although Belarus' more recent protests might have shifted opinion somewhat, the United States would still likely face an uphill battle at promoting regime change. Effectively promoting liberalization in Belarus would require European support. Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Ukraine all border Belarus, and turmoil in Belarus might produce second-order effects such as refugee flows in these countries. Moreover, should Russia horizontally escalate, these countries and others could face Russian wrath. Finally, even if Russia were to not respond as a new reformist government took office in Minsk, Europe would need to play a key role in the aftermath, ensuring that democratic reforms took hold and Belarus' economy revived. Europe currently faces a host of other challenges from Ukraine to refugees to Brexit, and it might not want to add Belarus to the mix. Indeed, after Belarus elections in October 2015, EU foreign ministers suspended sanctions against that country temporarily after Belarus released some of its political prisoners despite widespread allegations of voter fraud and warnings that Belarus was headed toward a soft dictatorship. Arguably, there might be even less desire to rock the boat now than there was in 2015. Conclusion. Promoting regime change in Belarus is one of the most escalatory options considered in this report. Such an effort probably would not succeed and could provoke a strong Russian response, including the possibility of military action. Such a reaction might extend Russia by requiring the nation to commit resources to preserve its grasp over Belarus, thereby provoking the United States and its European allies to respond with harsher sanctions, but the result would be a general deterioration of the security environment in Europe and a setback for US policy. Nevertheless, if the United States were to step up its ideological and informational competition with Russia more generally, as will be examined in Chapter 5, including Belarus in such a campaign might make sense. Measure 4. Exploit tensions in the South Caucasus. Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia were part of the Soviet Union, and Russia still maintains significant sway over the region today. Figure 4.1. In August 2008, after peace agreements with separatists broke down, Georgia fought a brief war over the South Ossetia and Abkhazia enclaves, two semi-independent pro-Russia provinces of Georgia. The war proved disastrous for Georgia. Russia quickly intervened and eventually occupied both regions and, briefly, other parts of Georgia as well. Georgia signed a ceasefire agreement on August 14, 2008, only 8 days after the Russian intervention. However, Russian forces remain in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, both of which have since declared their independence. Today, Russia recognizes both South Ossetia and Abkhazia as separate countries, one of the few governments to do so, and is committed to their defense. Russia's foreign policy concept states that assisting the establishment of the Republic of Abkhazia and the Republic of South Ossetia as modern democratic states, strengthening their international positions, and ensuring reliable security and socio-economic recovery remains a priority for Russia. Russia also maintains an active military presence in the region. In September 2016, 4,000 Russian troops participated in a military exercise in South Ossetia. On January 25, 2018, the Russian Duma approved a military agreement that allowed for the inclusion of separate units of the armed forces of the Republic of South Ossetia into the armed forces of the Russian Federation. Russia also plays a key role with Azerbaijan and Armenia, particularly over the disputed territory of Nagorno-Karabakh. Ethnically Armenian, but geographically located within Azerbaijan, Nagorno-Karabakh has bid to join the Armenia Soviet Socialist Republic. During the latter years of the Soviet Union was denied by the Soviet Politburo because of the risk of encouraging secessionist movements elsewhere. In 1992, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Armenia and Azerbaijan declared independence and fought a war over this enclave. The war ended with Armenian forces controlling Nagorno-Karabakh and some surrounding provinces, and Russia brokered a ceasefire in May 1994. Armenia and Azerbaijan never reached a final peace agreement, and armed clashes continue to this day. The United States could extend Russia in the Caucasus in two ways. First, the United States could push for a closer NATO relationship with Georgia and Azerbaijan, likely leading Russia to strengthen its military presence in South Ossetia, Abkhazia, Armenia, and southern Russia. Alternatively, the United States could try to induce Armenia to break with Russia. Although a long-standing Russian partner, Armenia has also developed ties with the West. It provides troops to NATO-led operations in Afghanistan and is a member of NATO's Partnership for Peace, and it also recently agreed to strengthen its political ties with the EU. The United States might try to encourage Armenia to move fully into the NATO orbit. If the United States were to succeed in this policy, then Russia might be forced to withdraw from its army base at Gyumri and an army and air base near Yerevan, currently leased until 2044, and divert even more resources to its southern military district. The United States might also renew efforts to bring Georgia into NATO. Georgia has long sought NATO membership. It joined the North Atlantic Cooperation Council in 1992 shortly after becoming independent and joined the Partnership for Peace program in 1994. In theory, the Allies put Georgia on a path to membership, but but the 2008 Russo-Georgia War put this effort on indefinite hold. Georgia, however, has never given up on its NATO ambitions, participating in NATO operations in the Mediterranean, Kosovo, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. If European opposition prevents Georgia's accession into the alliance, the United States could establish bilateral security ties. The United States could also do the same for Armenia and Azerbaijan, although both countries have shown less interest in joining NATO. Like Georgia, both countries are members of the Partnership for Peace program and have contributed to NATO operations in Kosovo and Afghanistan over the years as well, albeit to lesser extents. Benefits. While the principal aim of these policies would be to extend Russia, closer relationships with Georgia, Azerbaijan, or Armenia might yield important secondary benefits for the United States. The geographic position of Azerbaijan makes it a prime location for both intelligence gathering and deterrence measures relating to Iran, especially because many of Iran's Kurdish and Iranian populations are concentrated near the Azeri-Iranian border. Stronger ties with Georgia, hailed by the Conservative Heritage Foundation as one of America's best allies in Europe for providing one of the largest contributions of troops to Iraq and Afghanistan, could pay strategic dividends in the future. Increased U.S. involvement in the region could produce additional economic benefits as well. The Caspian Sea remains a key producer of both oil and natural gas. Indeed, the U.S. Department of Energy estimates that there are 48 billion barrels of oil and 292 trillion cubic feet of natural gas in proved and probable reserves in the Caspian basins. Almost 75% of oil reserves and 67% of natural gas reserves are located within 100 miles of the coast. A closer political relationship with Azerbaijan would help secure continued access to these resources for the United States and perhaps more important for its allies in the future. Risks. Azerbaijan, an authoritarian country often cited by non-governmental organizations for its poor political and civil rights record, has shown no interest in a closer relationship with the West or with Russia. Moving it from this comfortably neutral stance would be difficult. Given the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia over Nagorno-Karabakh, any effort to strengthen ties with one would likely antagonize the other. If either country turned westward for its security, the other would likely turn toward Moscow. Finally, increased US or NATO commitment in this region would be more likely to extend the West's resources than Russia's. As with the Baltic states, geography makes these countries more difficult for the West to defend than for Russia to threaten. All three countries are militarily inferior to Russia and geographically closer to it than to Western Europe, let alone the United States. As a result, these countries would be far more likely to be consumers than producers of NATO security, assuming such a guarantee were ever offered. Russia views this region as part of its traditional sphere of influence and, unsurprisingly, has concerns about NATO forces on its border. Historically, Russia has been willing to fight to prevent the region from developing too close a relationship with the West. Indeed, analysts point to a desire to stop Georgia's aspiration to join NATO and restore Russia's sphere of influence as one of the underlying factors behind the 2008 Russo-Georgia War. Faced with the prospect of closer Georgian ties with NATO or the United States, Russia might well intervene again. This would impose military, economic, and political costs on Russia, but also be viewed as a setback for US policy. Likelihood of success. None of these initiatives offers much hope of success. Attempts to develop closer relationships with Azerbaijan or flipping Armenia likely would encounter serious obstacles. To be sure, Russia actively supports Armenia, and Russia and Azerbaijan have had several diplomatic and economic disputes, including the freezing of Azeri oil through the Baku-Novorossiysk pipeline. However, Azerbaijan also has historically courted Russian support. Indeed, in August 2016, Russia and Azerbaijan agreed to a strategic partnership with a goal of increasing economic ties and military aid. Georgia is theoretically slated for NATO membership sometime in the distant future. It is hard to see this occurring for a variety of reasons, particularly as long as two pieces of its territory are occupied by Russia and claim to be independent states. Major European governments are opposed to any early move toward membership. Any effort to bolster the Western orientation of states in the South Caucasus would require the support of Turkey, which provides these countries with their only outlet to the West. But Turkey's relationship with the United States remains shaky at best, particularly after the failed coup attempt of July 15, 2016, and Turkey's recent announcement that it would procure the Russian S-400 air defense system. Armenia also has several reasons why it might be unwilling to break with Russian patronage. Russia has protected Armenia from Azerbaijan for decades, and Armenia might be reluctant to part with long-standing support, especially as long as the Nagorno-Karabakh region remains in dispute. Moreover, Russia is already Armenia's largest trading partner and has a $500 million investment in a railroad to provide that economic link, but the tracks must pass through either Georgia or Azerbaijan. If Armenia were to strengthen its relationships with the West, Russia could retaliate against Armenia with sanctions, placing this trade at risk. Finally, resolving Nagorno-Karabakh is likely a prerequisite to Armenia breaking with Russia, but it is unclear precisely how the United States or NATO could resolve the decades-old conflict without privileging one side and antagonizing the other. NATO has encouraged both parties to resolve the conflict through the Minsk group led by the Russians. Conclusion: European allies are not likely to extend defense commitments into the South Caucasus in the foreseeable future. Short of that happening, there is only limited scope for more Western economic and political ties to the region, although even small changes could continue to stoke Russian anxieties and divert Russian resources in a minor way. Measure 5. Reduce Russian influence in Central Asia. Russia is part of two economic ventures related to Central Asia, the EU and the Belt and Road Initiative. Russia has benefited from both, although in the case of the former, partners might have been harmed economically. There might be steps the United States and allies could take to reduce Russia's benefits from both of these. The EU was established at the beginning of 2015 with founding members Russia, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. Since then, Armenia and Kyrgyzstan have also joined. Although the EU is new, the institution builds on previous efforts in reintegrating the states of the former Soviet Union. Kazakhstan President Nazarbayev introduced the idea of Eurasian integration in the 1990s, and the Eurasian Economic Community was formed in 2000. Russia, Kazakhstan, and Belarus then launched a customs union in 2010 and a supranational Eurasian Economic Commission, EEC, in 2012. That EEC is now an institution of the EU and is located in Moscow, staffed with 1,000 professionals. The EU had the misfortune to launch when oil prices crashed. Given that two members, Russia and Kazakhstan, are major oil producers and the third, Belarus, relies on subsidies from Russia, the union got off to a rocky start. Figure 4.2. Russian goods exports to Belarus fell from $16.5 billion in 2014 to $12.4 billion in 2015. Russian goods exports to Kazakhstan fell from $13.9 billion in 2014 to $10.3 billion in 2015. Likewise, Russian goods imports from Belarus fell from $12.3 billion in 2014 to $8.0 billion in 2015, and Russian goods imports from Kazakhstan fell from $7.2 billion in 2014 to $4.3 billion in 2015. Goods trade with Belarus rebounded somewhat in 2016, but was still lower than in 2014. Similarly, in 2017, Belarus-Russia trade continued to strengthen, with $12.5 billion in exports to Russia from Belarus and imports from Russia to Belarus increasing to $19.6 billion, but are still below their peak averages. In contrast, goods trade with Kazakhstan continued to decline. Those declines in trade can hardly be blamed on the EU, given the broader macroeconomic disturbances striking the members, but the EU did have some negative characteristics. First, as a condition of membership, Kazakhstan had to raise tariffs on a large number of products, and non-tariff barriers were introduced, such as increased clearance time for trucks from non-member Central Asian countries. Newer members Kyrgyzstan and Armenia also had to raise tariffs, and this has harmed Kyrgyzstan's role as a hub of re-exports for Chinese and Turkish goods. However, there have been benefits. For Kyrgyzstan, in particular, which sends 92% of its migrant workers to Russia, membership has meant better treatment of those workers and a competitive edge over workers from non-member counties. More broadly than the economic effects, there appears to be a conflict of visions. For Russia, the EU is more of a geopolitical project than an economic one, while economics is the underlying rationale for other members. Furthermore, to the extent the ideology behind it is one of Eurasianism, there is disagreement among the members about exactly what this means. Compounding these issues, the EU has not operated well institutionally. National leaders have ignored the EEC and the organization's rules and processes, and Russia has taken unilateral trade measures outside the EU, such as its sanctions on European and US agricultural imports. The other major Eurasian initiative of which Russia is a part, the Belt and Road Initiative, was launched in 2013 with 2 speeches by Chinese President Xi Jinping, one announcing the Silk Road economic belt and the other a 21st-century maritime Silk Road. Originally known as One Belt, One Road, the venture has now become known by its current name. The belt consists of a series of overland infrastructure networks through Russia and Central Asia to South Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. The road refers to maritime routes from China through the South China Sea and across the Indian Ocean to South Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. Chinese official statements have portrayed it as an effort to build a vast web of infrastructure such as roads, railways, and pipelines coupled with other efforts to build 5 types of connectivity, policy or political coordination, transportation connectivity, trade and investment cooperation, financial integration and use of the Chinese renminbi as a currency, and stronger people-to-people connections. The Belt and Road Initiative has been cited as involving more than 60 countries and leading to almost $1 trillion of new investment. However, it is not a comprehensive strategy or plan. Chinese officials note that it is an initiative, not a strategy, that all countries are invited to participate, and that it is meant to complement existing national and regional initiatives. Although many elements of the Belt and Road Initiative predated Xi's announcements, often by many years, the broad effort is flexible with the potential to reshape Eurasian economic relations. However, with limited capacity to absorb investment in many countries and the potential for politically driven projects, it could also result in high levels of growth-slowing indebtedness and wasteful spending. There are a number of ways that the United States and Europe could build off the EU and the Belt and Road Initiative to extend Russia economically. These are based on weaknesses and uncertainties embedded in the plans. At a summit in Moscow in May 2015, Putin and Xi agreed that the EU and Belt and Road complemented each other and that the 2 countries would coordinate the initiatives. However, the projects clash economically because the EU creates barriers, whereas the Belt and Road Initiative focuses on lowering them. Furthermore, the Belt and Road Initiative could decrease Russian influence in Central Asia, one reason Russia has opposed a free trade agreement as part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Central Asian countries, although reliant on Russia for security and hopeful for Chinese investment, do not welcome and even fear domination by either country. They see EU involvement as a way to limit the activities of both giants and even to help with the institutional aspects of integration. It is not clear that they view the United States in the same light, although the start of a new U.S. Central Asia initiative known as the C5+1 in 2015 might signal that they do. The United States and the Central Asian countries have agreed to 5 projects, including security, competitiveness, transport, energy, and climate. In addition, at the meeting in Riyadh in May 2017, Kazakhstan President Nazarbayev, speaking to U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, expressed hope for stronger bilateral ties. As part of Belt and Road, China is establishing railway and other transport corridors to Europe, with 29 Chinese cities linked to Europe by railway as of late May 2017. Although most routes run through Russia, one bypass runs through Kazakhstan, from Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan's eastern border with China, to the western Kazakhstan port of Aktau on the Caspian Sea, and then by ship to Azerbaijan and on to Europe. Such a route, bypassing Russia, reportedly causes tension between China and Russia. This combination of vulnerabilities suggests a number of possible actions, a few of which the United States could take alone, but most of which would require cooperation with Europe or are Europe-only approaches. The first action involves trade and technical agreements. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Armenia are members of the EU and thus cannot sign separate trade agreements with the United States or Europe. Furthermore, the framework of the EU's association agreements and deep and comprehensive free trade area agreements would need the partner country to control its external tariffs, and the EU is not seeking to bring Central Asian countries into association agreements anyway. Only Kazakhstan would be a suitable participant, and it would be unlikely to risk Moscow's probable objection. However, EU members could sign a variety of other agreements. The Kazakhstan Enhanced Partnership and Cooperation Agreement, signed with the EU in October 2015, is one example. Accordingly, the United States could continue to develop deeper economic relations with Central Asian EU members, as envisioned in the C5+1 program, and even explore free trade agreements with non-EU members. Likewise, Europe could deepen its economic cooperation and institution building in Central Asia, including better coordinating its various efforts. Because of geographic remoteness from the United States, free trade agreements with Central Asian countries would have only marginal effects. Attempting to negotiate would also incur political costs, such as objection from Moscow or US human rights organizations. The second action involves whether and how to engage with the EU. Neither the United States nor Europe should deal with the EU as an institution. As noted, Moscow embargoed EU agricultural products unilaterally, without EU support. Instead, EU member Belarus served as a conduit for those products into Russia, helping Europe bypass the embargo. Furthermore, the EC has few mechanisms for forcing members to follow its decisions, and there is no resolution mechanism for complex disagreements except through political leaders. Dealing bilaterally could not only weaken the sway of Russia via the EU over EU members, but might actually be more effective at forging agreements. A third action involves helping develop transportation corridors that bypass Russia. One of the 5 projects under the C5+1 initiative is transport corridor development. Specifically, this would help make trade within Central Asia more efficient and create a more efficient non-Russian route to Europe. Taking this action could include help with transportation planning, aid for road and rail infrastructure improvement, and aid to improve the operations of the Kazakhstan ports of Aktau and Kurik to the Azerbaijan port of Baku. Politics allowing, there could also be assistance in creating a better land route via Turkmenistan through Iran to Turkey, bypassing the intermodal logistical hurdles of traversing the Caspian Sea. The United States could join with Europe to support, or Europe could unilaterally accelerate the Transport Corridor Europe-Caucasus-Asia initiative, conceived in 1993 with 9 non-EU countries and expanded after 1998 with an additional 5 non-EU countries. The EU stopped funding this initiative in 2009, and funding had not been restored as of June 2016. Restoring it could help accelerate the project. Furthermore, both the United States and the EU could support Chinese transport corridor efforts that bypass Russia. There is room for improvement. Routes from China through Central Asia feature border delays, hefty customs fees, and poor roads and railways, all of which are amenable to policy action. The geographic hurdles of mountain ranges in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are less amenable, however. Benefits. Engaging more with Central Asia could have modest benefits. Expanding Central Asian connectivity to the rest of the world could reduce the area's trade with Russia. It must be noted, however, that economic growth within these countries would likely have the opposite effect and increase their trade with Russia because economic size and trade are correlated. However, greater connectivity suggests that the proportion of total trade with Russia would likely fall. Better trade routes could also decrease the amount of transit through Russia, lowering Russian revenues from that trade. Finally, if successful, spurring growth in Central Asia might also increase trade with the United States and benefit the US economy, albeit to a limited extent. Risks. There are several risks to increasing engagement with Central Asia. First, it could be costly. These are distant, sparsely populated countries that might not have the capacity to absorb large amounts of investment efficiently. This could mean that a more moderate, longer-term approach might be a better strategy. Transit routes through Russia are cheaper, and developing alternative transit routes through Central Asia could require subsidies. Further strengthening transit routes is also likely to benefit China. If US policymakers are concerned about a rising China, then economically extending Russia in this domain could mean helping a rival power economically. An additional risk arises from Russia's perceptions of and potential reactions to US actions. Russia views Central Asia as an important area of influence. Likewise, Central Asia relies on Russia for security, especially with challenges from terrorism and a deteriorating situation in Afghanistan. A challenge to Russian primacy in this region could invite unwelcome retaliation from Russia that could range from cyber actions against the United States, its allies, and the Central Asian countries to the movement of Russian troops into these countries. Likelihood of success. Increasing engagement with Central Asia could have many benefits. It could expand market opportunities for the United States and its allies and partners, lead to economic development in the region, and create closer cooperation between the region and the United States in a number of areas, including economic, political, and even scientific domains. However, it would be unlikely to economically extend Russia without a very large monetary cost to the United States, and most Central Asian countries likely would be reluctant partners in any campaign aimed against Russia. Geographic proximity to Russia and China, existing trade links and security links, and historical patterns of cooperation suggest that these countries would prefer to stay within the Russian orbit and seek cooperation with it, even as they diversify their relations. The real work of extending Russia economically in Central Asia would fall to China, and that potential competition is in the early days of being manifested. Conclusion. Reducing Russian influence in Central Asia would be very difficult and could prove costly, and Russia's influence might be reduced there in the long term without this measure. China will continue to expand there through its Belt and Road Initiative, and Japan and India have also engaged with the region, all of which could reduce Russia's dominance. The main reason for increasing U.S. engagement in the region would be to benefit the United States, gaining modest help in implementing U.S. foreign policy goals, creating new opportunities for U.S. businesses, and channeling China's outward efforts in directions amenable to the United States. Without great cost, however, increased engagement would be unlikely to extend Russia much economically, and backlash would need to be guarded against. Measure 6. Challenge Russian presence in Moldova. Nestled between Romania and Ukraine with no seacoast of its own, Moldova, a former republic of the Soviet Union, is now an independent country. Transnistria is a Russian-speaking enclave within Moldova that currently hosts a Russian peacekeeping, some might say occupation, force and army base. John Todd Stewart, who was U.S. ambassador to Moldova from 1995 to 1998, described Moldova as the Florida of the Soviet Union, the republic with the most temperate climate, which was attractive to retirees. These people do not speak Romanian and have no connections with the area, period. As the Soviet Union was collapsing in 1990, Transnistria, home to about 500,000 Russophone residents, today broke away from Moldova. A brief conflict between pro-Transnistrian forces and the Moldovan police and military ended inconclusively. Moldova never reasserted its control over the breakaway region, but no member of the United Nations, including Russia, recognized its existence either. Therefore, Transnistria has existed in a sort of netherworld for the past several decades. Officially, Russian policy toward Transnistria is ambiguous. Russia's foreign policy concept includes only a single, rather inarticulate statement: Russia strongly advocates a political and diplomatic settlement of conflicts in the post-Soviet space. Specifically, Russia works within the existing multilateral negotiating mechanism to find an inclusive solution to the Transnistrian issue, respecting the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and neutral status of the Republic of Moldova in determining the special status of Transnistria. Russia has stationed between 1,000 and 2,000 peacekeepers in Transnistria, most of whom are recruited locally from the Russian-speaking population, and provides the residents with free natural gas and some pension assistance. According to some estimates, this amounts to $150 million in support a year. For its part, Transnistria keeps a pro-Russian government and prominently displays banners around town declaring that Russia brings peace and stability. During the 1990s, Moldova received $25 million a year from the United States Agency for International Development, making it one of the larger per capita recipients of U.S. aid in the former Soviet bloc. The United States also sought to promote resolution of the Transnistrian problem via the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. In 2005, the EU also established the European Union Border Assistance Mission to Moldova and Ukraine, staffed by approximately 200 staff and field officers. Part of the assistance mission's goal is to contribute to the peaceful settlement of the Transnistrian conflict through confidence-building measures and a monitoring presence at the Transnistrian segment of the Moldova-Ukraine border. Unfortunately, these efforts have not successfully resolved the dispute. The United States could encourage Transnistria's youth, who, according to some journalistic accounts, might be more pro-West than their elders, to push their pseudo-state to leave the Russian orbit. Transnistria's Russophile population and strong institutions, including a secret service still called the KGB, raise questions about this option's feasibility. Moreover, even if this policy were successful and Transnistria rejoined Moldova, it could very well be a cost-imposing strategy against the United States and its allies rather than on Russia, given that Transnistria is impoverished and would likely require substantial Western aid. The United States could also push for closer NATO and European integration with Moldova. While Moldova officially remains neutral, it already adopted the Partnership for Peace program in 1994 and Individual Partnership Action Plan in 2006. Moldova also contributed a token number of peacekeepers to the Kosovo operation beginning in 2013. Under this option, the United States would encourage closer NATO cooperation with Moldova and possibly eventually offer it membership. Finally, Washington could urge Moldova to terminate the July 21, 1994, ceasefire agreement between Moldovan President Milošević and Russian President Yeltsin that serves as the legal basis for Russian peacekeepers in Transnistria. Ultimately, the intent here would be to increase the diplomatic costs for Russia to continue its presence in the area. Benefits. Such an effort might be welcomed in Romania. Moldova, then known as Bessarabia, was once part of Romania, and many Moldovans speak a language similar to Romanian. In the early 1990s, there was some discussion of whether Moldova would eventually merge into Romania. Even though that has not yet occurred, Romania still takes a protective attitude toward its smaller eastern neighbor. A policy aimed at supporting and unifying Moldova might also help resolve the perennial threat of crime and political conflict in this region. Historically, Transnistria has had high levels of organized crime, mostly engaged in black market trade. Risks. Russia might employ economic sanctions against Moldova. Before the Ukraine crisis, Russia accounted for 23% of Moldova's foreign direct investment, 26% of its exports, and 14% of its imports. In some sectors, such as Moldova's fruit exports, Russia represented 60 to 70% of its export market. Beginning in September 2013, Russia embargoed key Moldovan industries, such as alcoholic beverages, meat, fruit, and vegetables in response to Moldova signing an association agreement with the EU. Moldova sold its agricultural goods to other buyers, but the embargo still dealt a significant blow to its economy, and Moldova has pleaded with Russia for relief. Presumably, any action on Transnistria would dash any Moldovan hopes of relief from the embargo and likely encourage additional sanctions. Finally, in the absence of Russian peacekeepers, the Transnistrian regime and population might violently resist incorporation into Moldova, a resistance that Moscow could abet from afar. Indeed, it is probably a concern about such a conflict that leads Moldova to tolerate the continued Russian military presence. Assuming such resistance could be overcome, the United States and the EU would be expected to pick up the tab for any post-conflict reconstruction. Likelihood of success. Moldovan cooperation in an effort to expel the Russians would not be easy to secure. In an interview with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Moldova's pro-Russian President Igor Dodon stated, "A NATO office in Chisinau, Moldova's capital, in a neutral country, is a provocation. I do not want this. I want neither NATO nor this Russia-led military alliance as far as armed forces are concerned." Dodon is also a fan of keeping a Russian presence in Transnistria. In January 2017, he stated, "It is necessary to understand that peacekeepers at the Dnistru River did not appear accidentally, but because of the conflict. And they were and remain the guarantor of certain stability. They are there to ensure trust between the banks. Despite the fact that political power lies with Moldova's prime minister rather than its president, Dodon was still the first president to be directly popularly elected since 1997 and consequently an important symbolic figure. Moreover, given the blow that Russian sanctions had to the Moldovan economy, Dodon might not be alone. On the other hand, after the Russian embargo, Moldovan exports to the EU grew by 27% and EU aid to Moldova amounted to some €335 million from 2014 to 2017. The EU also gave Moldova visa-free access in 2014, a key benefit for a landlocked country. Conclusion. The expulsion of Russian troops from Moldova would be a blow to Russian prestige, but it would also save Moscow money and quite possibly impose additional costs on the United States and its allies. It might be worth trying as an essentially punitive measure that would be part of a broader campaign to limit Russian prestige and influence, as discussed in the next chapter, but success would not extend Russia. Recommendations. Extending Russia through geopolitical competition is a fundamentally difficult and dangerous proposition. One might bait Russia into extending its foreign commitments, but only at the risk of serious setbacks to local US partners. Even if such efforts succeeded in generating Russian withdrawals, the result would be the opposite of an extension. Table 4.1. Providing support for Syrian anti-regime rebels and trying to instigate a color revolution in Belarus would both be quite risky, albeit for different reasons. In the case of Syria, additional aid to the rebels might jeopardize other US policy priorities, most notably combating radical Islamic terrorism. Such a move also risks further destabilizing the entire region. Moreover, this option might not even be feasible, given the fragmentation and decline of the Syrian opposition. Instigating a revolution in Belarus would pose several practical challenges, but also threatens one of Moscow's core security interests. Very likely, a revolution in Belarus would provoke a strong response from Russia and might even start another armed conflict if elements in Belarus were to resist, as occurred in Ukraine. Geography and history make it difficult for the United States to compete with Russia in the Caucasus economically and militarily. Developing a closer relationship with Moldova and removing the local Russian troop presence there would be seen as a diplomatic defeat for the Putin regime. Russia's commitment in eastern Ukraine is its greatest point of external vulnerability. Local opposition is active and Ukraine is a larger and more capable adversary than any of the other states where Russian troops are committed. Even here, however, Russia possesses local military superiority and thus controls the possibility of escalation dominance. Any increase in US military arms and advice to Ukraine would need to be carefully calibrated to increase the costs to Russia of sustaining its existing commitment without provoking a much wider and even more violent conflict. Finally, any geopolitical moves to extend Russia would also need to consider other options that, for reasons of length and resources, were not considered here in depth, namely, intensifying NATO's cooperation with Sweden and Finland, pressuring Russia's claims in the Arctic, and checking its influence in the Arctic. Table 4.1 Findings for geopolitical measures. Measure. Provide lethal aid to Ukraine. Benefits high. Costs and risks high. Likelihood of success medium. Measure. Increase support to the Syrian rebels. Benefits medium. Costs and risks high. Likelihood of success low. Measure. Promote regime change in Belarus. Benefits high. Costs and risks high. Likelihood of success low. Measure. Exploit tensions in the South Caucasus. Benefits low. Costs and risks medium. Likelihood of success low. Measure. Reduce Russian influence in Central Asia. Benefits low. Costs and risks medium. Likelihood of success low. Measure. Challenge Russian presence in Moldova. Benefits low. Costs and risks medium. Likelihood of success low.